Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. Today I have two stories for you. We start off hearing from three friends visiting Thayer Beach in Vermont. Their hideous encounter is so intense that all three feared for their lives. And then we head west to East Lansing, Michigan to learn what a female jogger experienced in the early morning hours of November 19th, 2003. We are the first to hear her story, so be sure to listen to the end. Finally, I would love to notify you every time I release new stories, so turn on those notifications. Now let's get into the stories. Today's story takes place in the early fall of 2017, where an unexplained creature was sighted just outside of Burlington, Vermont, about 20 minutes or so north along Lake Champlain. Jerry and his girlfriend Cindy had come up from New York City to visit Jerry's college friend Patrick. Patrick lived in Colchester, right near the water, and they were all looking forward to a weekend with no exact plans. All three of them were about a year out of college at this point, but Patrick was still living at his parents' place, trying to find a job but not having much luck. Actually, in general, he wasn't doing too well handling life after college, and Jerry was actually pretty worried about him. The truth is that Jerry and Cindy were basically there to support Patrick and to help him get out of the dumps. But Jerry passed off the trip to Patrick as if they themselves needed the break from the city, and they just wanted to visit for the weekend, to get some fresh air. Anyway, Jerry and Cindy arrived a bit early. Patrick wasn't quite home yet, so they decided to head to Thayer Beach to enjoy the crisp autumn air. The beach was so close to Patrick's they could have basically walked to it, but they drove instead. They decided to take the long way around and check out the rest of the area a bit. The ocean breeze was blowing, and they remember that at the moment the air smelled fresh. Noticeable to them because it was totally different than the city and the experience that they have living there. They even had their windows down in their car despite the chill in the air just to breathe it all in. Finally, they turned the corner and they arrived at the car park for the beach. They parked and started getting out of the car. Interestingly, as they look back on that exact moment of getting out of the car, they both remember smelling something foul, although neither one of them said anything at the time, just thinking that it was a small dead animal in the vicinity or a whiff of garbage. Also, being from the city, strange smells were not much to think about, let alone mention. From the parking lot to the beach, there's a short walk through some dense trees. The two of them heading off, and as they were walking, Jerry got a call from Patrick asking where they were. Jerry said they had just parked and were now walking towards the beach. Patrick said that that was one of his favorite places, and that he would come and meet them there in about 20 minutes or so. He told them to just stay put there and enjoy the area until he arrived. All agreed, and Jerry and Cindy walked the short path through the trees to the beach, but both were very much aware at that point in time of a strange energy as they walked along the path. At one point, Cindy even gave Jerry a quick side glance and quickened her pace, although nothing was said out loud. He wondered what was up with her as he watched her walk in front of him, but all was forgotten once they reached the sand. Birds were squawking loudly as if the forest was coming alive, and they even saw a rabbit hopping around. Although a local would have noticed that the noise and the activity was strange at that time of day, they didn't think anything of it. Eventually, Patrick showed up and the three of them continued walking along the beach. The sun was starting to set at this point, and Cindy remembers thinking how relaxing it was, and her mind even started to wander and wonder why they lived in the city. Her mind was even becoming preoccupied with coming up with a plan to convince Jerry that they should move out of the city too. They were enjoying each other's company, just chatting away, chatting about normal things, when all of a sudden, they all heard a loud rushing noise coming from behind them. They all ducked as they watched a flock of birds, hundreds of birds, come swooping out of the trees. And then before they knew it, they made a huge arc in the sky and headed back inland about 50 yards further up the beach from where they started. Literally, Within seconds, they flew out, circled, and were gone. So that's when Jerry looked back over to his right, towards the direction that the birds had come from, and that's when he saw it. The figure was unclear at first because it was still beyond the tree line, hidden in the shadows of the trees, and it had only been a fleeting moment of movement, but he remembered realizing even then that it was huge, at least 8 feet tall and covered in long, dark hair. He definitely remembers the feeling of his heart racing and the blood draining from his head as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He felt like it was a creature out of a horror movie. And before he knew it, without even a conscious thought, he started moving himself and Cindy towards their car. He was pulling on her hand to get her to move, while her body swayed, not wanting to move, staring at the creature in disbelief. He remembered, too, that they were both screaming at this point. Cindy screaming in fear, and Jerry screaming for them all to run. But Patrick, he was now standing there, just staring at the creature, rooted, his feet stuck to the one spot in the sand. And that's when the creature slowly started coming out from behind the trees and bringing itself more into the light. Jerry remembers seeing its face for the first time and thinking to himself that despite its height and hair, this thing was definitely not human. Its eyes were wild and bloodshot, and the face was contoured into what looked like a snarl. Saliva was dripping from its mouth, and its fingers continuously opened and clenched back up again as if it was envisioning clawing something apart. Jerry looked over at Patrick again, and they could see the terror in his eyes. The creature now lumbered more quickly in their direction, and then breaking into a full run as it exited the trees. "Run!" Jerry yelled. Patrick finally snapped out of it. He uprooted himself from the sand and flew past Cindy and Jerry in the direction of the cars. His years of running cross-country were now kicking in. At this point, all 3 of them were running towards their cars, but Jerry and Cindy were much slower than Patrick, and the creature was getting closer and closer. And now Jerry could hear it breathing heavily behind him, almost as if it was enjoying the chase by staying close and breathing down his neck. Yet, not doing anything, not touching them in any way. It was at this point, while the creature was closing in, that Cindy and Jerry would later remember that they smelled that same putrid smell as when they originally got out of their car. They stumbled as they ran along the path, but eventually burst forth out of the trees and into the car lot. They could now hear the creature pounding on the ground behind them, just a few yards back, but it never actually caught up to them. With their cars in sight, they gave it all they could to reach them as fast as they could. They yanked open the doors and slammed them behind them, locking them in place. They collapsed in the cars in relief as they watched Patrick start his car and drive away. Unfortunately, they still weren't completely safe. The creature was coming closer now walking slowly towards their car, and Jerry remembers thinking that they were going to die. And then it was just outside the car door, and not wanting to look it in the eye, Jerry watched the creature's hands reaching out and trying to find a way to open the door and get to them. It seemed frustrated as it continuously growled and tugged on the handle, jiggling it fiercely, almost ripping it off the door itself. Thinking it's now or never, Jerry turned the key in the ignition and took off. Not having a clear path out of the exit, he gunned the car over a strip of grass separating the lot from the road and took off back in the direction of Patrick's house, hurling the car down Holy Cross Road and not caring one bit about how fast he was driving. All the while, as Jerry was maneuvering the car, Cindy was watching the creature, not taking her eyes off of it. She later said that as they were pulling away, all of a sudden, the creature stopped, and it just stood there staring after them, with a look almost of satisfaction on its face. And then she watched as it turned around and walked back into the woods. When Jerry, Cindy, and Patrick all got back to Patrick's, they didn't know what to do. They all just sat in the living room, not talking or making any noise, all of them wondering what the creature was, and did it really happen? It was Cindy who finally broke the silence. She asked Jerry and Patrick if they thought they should go back and look for it. They both vehemently said no. to which Cindy conceded was probably the best answer. The rest of the weekend was filled with anxiety and fear as they all tried to make sense of what they saw. Ultimately, they turned to the internet and found a few articles about similar creature sightings, but still had no exact answers as to if what they saw was real. As the days passed, they all slowly began to accept that they may have seen something real, and that there actually may not be a perfect answer as to what it was. After that weekend and until contacting us, they never talked about it again, but each of them still carries the fear and the anxiety of that day. Fear knowing that these things do exist and can show up probably anywhere, and also fear and anxiety that if they did share their story, people would think they were crazy. And with the internet the way that it is, they didn't want to risk being labeled as unhinged. The next story I'm sharing here is so insane that the woman who shared it has asked to be referred to by the name of Michelle, which isn't her real name. She says that the encounter was so intense that she hasn't shared it with anyone, mainly because she doesn't want to take the chance of having to live with the stigma of being called that woman, the one who thinks she saw a creature. The encounter starts with Michelle leaving her house on the morning of November 19th, 2003 for her daily run before work. It was early morning and an unusually warm morning for November in Michigan, which can be very cold. She lived in East Lansing in an apartment along Mount Hope Road near Michigan State University. And that morning the sun had just started to peek over the horizon, which meant that the temperatures would now slowly start to creep upwards. At this time, the streets were still mostly deserted, with only a few cars driving by every now and then. But that was exactly how Michelle liked it. Mornings like this were what kept her head clear and sane. She had a usual route that she ran, and her body could do it on autopilot. She ran along Mount Hope Road because it had a sidewalk and it felt safe to her. This particular day, she was deep in thought as her feet rhythmically hit the ground, thinking of a vacation she had coming up with a group of girls. And when all of a sudden, she heard a rustling and a grouping of bushes nearby. Now, ordinarily a strange noise wouldn't have fazed her since she's always been a city girl, and she knew that it was usually best to ignore strange noises and just move away from them quickly. But this noise was different. It sounded large, like whatever was making the noise was big. Michelle quickly remembered the flyers she saw in her apartment building by the mailboxes for a neighbor's missing dog, a dog that had last been seen 3 days ago. Her first thought was she wondered if it could be that dog, and she knew she had to check. She would never forgive herself if she didn't, and it was. And so she quickly stopped and tried to peer behind the bushes, trying to see what made the noise. And she leaned forward, trying to get a better visual. Suddenly, out from the shadows popped a very large, wolf-like creature. It was easily as big as a full-grown man, and it was now standing completely upright, staring at her. Michelle stood there with her eyes wide as saucers. She could see that it was about the size of a very large German shepherd standing, and its long back legs were furry. It had a long neck, large furry head, fur-covered arms that hung lower than she thought seemed to be normal. But of course, nothing about this was normal. Its fur was light brown with some black mixed in, and she remembers wishing she had a gun. She clearly felt danger emanating from this creature. And then it began to slowly walk towards her and stopped and stood there, staring at her for an amount of time that seemed like forever, but at the same time was probably seconds. And then the wind began to pick up and the scent of the creature hit her. It was rank. It was putrid. It made her nauseous. Eventually it turned around and walked away into the woods, leaving Michelle standing there completely dumbfounded, watching it as it melted back into the darkness from the direction it had come. Michelle remained frozen in place for a few moments after the creature disappeared, and then she immediately abandoned the rest of her run and turned around to make her way back home, trying in her mind to make sense of what she had seen, but also trying not to think about it so that she could get herself home safely. The whole way back, she tried to tell herself that it was just a large dog, but she knew that it wasn't the truth. It had been too big and too feral, too much like a werewolf. And then before getting too far, she thought about turning around to try and see if she really had just experienced this unknown creature. But she pretty quickly realized that that was a really bad idea, considering she was alone. It was so early in the morning, and the rest of the neighborhood was still likely asleep. So she abandoned that idea for now. But she told herself that one day she might come back to try and figure out whatever it was that she had seen that morning. So she started off again, back towards home. She could still smell the creature in the air. And then off in the distance, she thought she heard a howl that sounded almost human. And then additional howls that sounded like they were coming from all around her. She ran home as fast as she could, not wanting to be caught out in the open if that thing was coming back. Or things. And when she got back inside her house, she quickly locked all of the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. And she called the police. It took a while for them to arrive, but by the time they did, the sun was up. She could see their cruiser pulling into her driveway. Michelle ran out to meet them and recounted her entire story to the officers. But they didn't seem too concerned. They told her that they would head over to the area she mentioned and look around. They also promised to look into it and see if anybody else in the neighborhood had reported anything similar, but she never heard back from them. She decided to not reach back out. She figured that they wouldn't find anything anyway, because whatever she had seen that morning was long gone by now. She was sure of it. She was convinced that it was smart enough to know that it shouldn't be seen by the light of day. The whole incident left her feeling unsettled, and she began to feel like she was being watched. She was careful to lock her doors and her windows every night, but still, every time she went outside, she felt like eyes were on her, judging her, waiting for her. And not only eyes of the creature, but she felt self-conscious that people knew her story and were judging her when they saw her. The encounter was basically eating away at her self-confidence, and even her sanity. But she never did see the creature again, and eventually she convinced herself that it had all been a dream, a very vivid dream at that, because the alternative, believing in it, was just too difficult. And even now, years later, she still sometimes hears that howl in her dreams, and she still lets the thoughts into her mind that it might, just might, have been real. Let me know what you think about these stories in the comments below. And don't forget to check out Donovan Dread, who releases almost every single day. Also, if you like true crime, then check out Donovan Dread True Crime. There are new releases several times a week.